I was late to my son's wedding, and the sound of their joy without me cracked something inside my chest. I had woken before dawn the way I used to when he was little, slipping out of bed so quietly the house could go on pretending it was still night. I pressed the navy dress I'd saved for, steamed the small creases out of the sleeves, and fastened the pearl earrings I only touch for holy days and graduations. My hands, seamstress hands, sturdy and nicked by a lifetime of needles, shook a little as I folded the lace-edged handkerchief I'd stitched with his initials. "Be on time," I whispered to myself, the way I used to whisper "be brave" before parent-teacher meetings, before hospital visits, before every moment that asked a single mother to stand taller than she felt. Then the morning betrayed me. A burst main and a road closed 2 blocks from home sent traffic spilling into side streets that don't make sense unless you grew up there. The first driver rolled down his window, took one look at the flooded avenue and said, "Ma'am, you won't make it that way," as if a declaration could undo a promise. I walked farther than I should have in good shoes, flagged a cab that smelled of rain and coffee, and stared at the time on my phone as if the numbers were a heartbeat I could slow with breath. The driver tried a different route, then another. The city folded in on itself. Detours, flashing cones, a siren wandering somewhere I couldn't see. When we finally pulled up at the venue, music was spilling out into the afternoon like laughter you weren't meant to hear. A cheer went up inside. The doors swung, bridesmaids streamed past with bouquets lifted like flags, and someone shouted, "They're married!" The word struck me with the soft cruelty of a truth that arrives just after it can do you any good. I placed the gift on my lap, a bundle of linen sheets I'd embroidered at night under the yellow lamp, needle rising and falling the way hope does, and waited for my breath to catch up with my body. "You're here," I told myself, not sure whether to be grateful or ashamed. I didn't find the main entrance first. My feet, faithful to back ways and service doors, took me along a narrow path behind the building where the noise thinned to a shimmer. That's where I heard it, bright, careless voices striking flint against stone. "Honestly," a woman said, "I'm relieved she missed it. You know how she gets, those stories, the sad money talk, the martyr routine." Another voice hummed in agreement. "Mothers-in-law," she added like a punchline, "they think being poor is a personality." A giggle, the rustle of satin, a clink of glass. And can you imagine her outfit? I can't. I felt it, like a glass hairline in the center of my heart, invisible until the light hits it. The words didn't kill me. They downgraded me, shrank me, filed me into some box labeled liability. For a moment I stood very still, the way you do when a delicate seam threatens to tear and you're deciding whether to tug or let it be. Then I smoothed my dress, dabbed beneath one eye with the corner of my handkerchief, and chose dignity because that is what has always fit me best. Inside the reception hall, everything gleamed. Candles wearing halos, flowers with names I don't know, a head table draped like a stage. My son's face found me as if summoned. He moved toward me with the same urgency he used to have when he'd skin a knee and run for my lap. "You made it," he said, and for a second I believed the whole world could rewind to kindergarten art shows and cheap sheet cake and the two of us high-fiving over rent paid on time. His suit smelled faintly of cologne I couldn't afford to buy him, and when I kissed his cheek I felt the smoothness of a life I prayed into being. I wouldn't miss it, I told him, because love keeps its sentences simple. His bride approached with a smile that arrived before she did and left before she finished speaking. "What a shame," she said. The ceremony was breathtaking. The pause after shame did its work. I offered the gift with both hands. "For your new bed," I said. "Thread count isn't everything. Hands remember better than numbers." She slid the ribbon loose and lifted a corner of linen, eyes skimming the pattern the way people skim a menu when they already know what they'll order. "How thoughtful," she said, and set it aside as if thoughtfulness weighed less than brand names. I took my seat where there was one, with cousins of friends whose faces were kind and far away. The talk around me ran on a track I don't travel. Weekend flights, tasting menus, portfolios you manage with your thumb. It wasn't that anyone was cruel. Cruelty would have been easier to argue with. This was gentler and colder, a polite weather system that circles you and never touches your skin. I swallowed water that tasted faintly of silver and watched the dance floor fill with people who moved like they'd been practicing joy their whole lives. Every so often my son's eyes swept the room, and sometimes they landed on me. He'd smile, small and apologetic, the way people do at train windows when they're already moving. I smiled back, steady as a metronome. I refused to fold into smallness, refused to let those voices from the back path narrate me. I sat up straight. I let the music carry me to a time when he stood on my shoes and we waltzed across a kitchen floor that had to dry before bedtime. A toast was made. Laughter lifted. When the glasses clinked like tiny bells, I realized the future had arrived without asking if the past was ready. I could sit there and count the ways I didn't fit, or I could name what I had carried through storms. A spine, a craft, a love that never once checked a guest list. The choice didn't make the room warmer, but it made my breath steadier. I pressed my palm against the linen of my skirt and felt the stitch under the surface, the invisible one that keeps everything from unraveling, and promised myself something no one could overhear. This story would not end where their comfort began. The reception was a theater where every spotlight shone everywhere but on me. I slipped into the hall with a careful smile, but it was as though my presence dimmed the chandeliers instead of brightening them. My sister-in-law's polite introductions fluttered like tissue paper. "This is Ethan's mom," and before anyone could ask a single question about me, she redirected the conversation towards someone younger, richer, more glamorous. The gift I had poured 60 nights into, sheets embroidered with my son's initials and tiny flowers that bloomed out of my thread like prayers, barely lasted 10 seconds in their hands. A muttered, "Thank you," and then the bundle was swept beneath the table, hidden among afterthoughts. I watched it disappear while crystal glasses clinked and exclamations rang for imported gifts and branded appliances. My offering of love and labor had been demoted to clutter. At the dinner tables, laughter bloomed in clusters I couldn't join. Guests traded stories about overseas vacations, boutique restaurants, and investments that doubled overnight. My world of fabric, needle, and long hours had no currency here. Each time I tried to enter a conversation, I felt the air thin and their eyes dart away. My presence was tolerated, not welcomed, an obligation fulfilled rather than a joy embraced. I looked at my son, waiting for the moment he would cross the floor and pull me into a dance the way he always had, even at small family gatherings. But the music pulled him elsewhere, toward his new wife, toward his new friends, toward a world where I was more shadow than substance. I sat in my chair, tracing the rim of my water glass, the condensation beating like unshed tears. And then the moment came, so quiet most people would never notice, but to me it thundered. When I finally rose to leave, my son hugged me distractedly, his mind still with the circle of friends. My daughter-in-law's farewell kiss carried no warmth, only relief. In her eyes I saw it clearly. I was a weight lifted from the room the moment I walked out. The cab ride home stretched into silence. Outside the window, the city was alive with celebration, lights twinkling, music drifting from open doors. Inside me, though, there was only the echo of dismissal, the memory of my gift tucked beneath a table, and the realization that somewhere along the way, I had shifted from honored mother to inconvenient reminder of a past they would rather leave behind. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat in the rocking chair where I had stitched those sheets. For the first time in years, the needle of memory pricked deeper than the fabric. It pierced straight into the heart. And I wondered if everything I had built, every sacrifice I had made, had been quietly rewritten into a story where I no longer belonged. That night, when I finally returned home, the silence in my little apartment was deafening. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort. It presses against your chest like a weight. I hung the navy dress on the back of the closet door, the one I had pressed with such care that morning, and for the first time I saw it the way others might, not as elegant, but as outdated, old-fashioned. My fingers grazed the fabric, and suddenly those cruel words I had overheard in the garden came rushing back. Sad stories, old outfit, poor mother-in-law drama. I turned toward the mirror. What I saw there nearly broke me. A woman of 67 stared back. hair streaked with gray that I had always worn proudly, believing it was a crown of survival. Wrinkles that told the story of worry and laughter, sleepless nights and countless mornings of determination. Rough hands with permanent calluses from decades of sewing, the hands that had clothed my son, fed him, worked for him. To me, these were marks of honor. But in their world, in their eyes, they were marks of shame, reminders of a life they'd rather leave behind. I sat in my old rocking chair, the one where so many nights had blurred into dawns as I embroidered gifts, stitched clothes, and whispered prayers. That night, the chair creaked differently, as if even it knew the burden it now held. Memories began to pour in, not gentle ones, but sharp, piercing memories that demanded to be felt. I remembered the day Curtis died, how I had to bite my lip and swallow my tears so Ethan wouldn't see his mother break. I remembered taking on double shifts at the textile factory, then coming home with aching feet to cook a full meal so Ethan never went to bed hungry. I remembered saving pennies in a jar until there was just enough to pay for his private school tuition because I refused to let him be swallowed by the broken public system. I remembered Ethan's first baseball game, how I sold one of Curtis's watches to buy him the glove he wanted. He never knew. To him, that glove was just a birthday gift. To me, it was a piece of my husband, sacrificed for our son's dream. I remembered the first time Ethan brought Tasha home. I had cooked for hours, rice pudding, cornbread, roast chicken, vegetables arranged just so. Tasha had smiled, snapped photos for her social media, and told me it was cute that I still cooked so much. At the time, I laughed along. But now, years later, those words twisted into something else. They weren't admiration. They were condescension. As I sat there, rocking slowly, a terrible realization crawled into my chest. Had I been blind all this time? Had I mistaken tolerance for love, politeness for respect? Every act of sacrifice, every penny saved, every stitch sewn, every Sunday meal prepared, had I been telling myself a lie, believing they mattered more to him than they really did? I thought of the wedding gift, those embroidered sheets I had poured 60 nights into. My fingers had trembled while stitching their initials, intertwining them with tiny flowers. To me, it was love made visible. But to them, it was nothing more than a formality to be shoved under a table. That image seared itself into my mind. My work, my heart, my time, reduced to clutter. And then it hit me with a force I wasn't ready for. Maybe I was the same. Maybe to my son and his new world, I had become clutter too. Something that had served a purpose once, but no longer belonged in the gleaming life he was building. The thought carved through me like a blade. My love for him had been my life's work, my pride, my identity. But what if, in his world now, I was just a duty? A mother to visit once in a while, to call occasionally, but not someone who truly belonged. That realization did not explode like thunder. It cracked, silently, like porcelain under pressure, fragile, invisible, but permanent. A fracture that could never be undone. And for the first time in my life, sitting in that rocking chair with the city asleep around me, I whispered words I never thought I would. Maybe he doesn't need me anymore. Not as his mother. Not as the woman who gave him everything. Just as a memory. A name. A shadow he can keep at a distance. The tears came then, slow, hot, endless. They rolled down my face and onto my hands, hands that had built his world but now trembled in the quiet of their own abandonment. That night I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eyes. I just rocked and thought, and felt the deep crack inside me grow wider, stretching into something I wasn't ready to face. But deep down, in that unbearable silence, I knew life was about to change. The days after the wedding passed like a blur, but the heaviness in my chest never lifted. I tried to convince myself it was just the sting of the moment, that once Ethan and Tasha settled into married life, things would ease. But the silence between us grew louder. Calls became shorter, visits became rarer, and when they did come, there was always a polite excuse. We can't stay long, Mom, we've got dinner with friends, or Tasha's parents want us for brunch. Still, I waited. Because that's what mothers do. We wait, and we hope. But hope, I discovered, can weigh heavier than grief when it stretches on too long. And then, one evening, Ethan arrived at my apartment alone. I could see the unease in the way he shifted on the armchair where he used to do his homework as a boy. He folded his hands, stared at the floor, and finally looked up at me with eyes rehearsed for something hard. "Mom," he began, his voice careful, too careful. "There's something I need to say." My heart quickened. For a second, I imagined good news. Maybe a child on the way, maybe a new opportunity. But his next words shattered whatever fragile illusion I had left. "Tasha and I have been talking about our future, about the kind of life we want to build. And we think it would be better if you weren't so present at our social gatherings." His words dropped heavy into the room. At first, I didn't even understand. I tilted my head, waiting for him to clarify, certain I had misunderstood. "Awkward situations," he explained softly, as though gentleness could erase the cruelty. "You know, sometimes the things you say about money or about raising me alone, they make people uncomfortable. It's not wrong, Mom, but it doesn't fit. And when we're with Tasha's family, or her friends, or my colleagues, we just don't want those things to overshadow us." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Overshadow them? My entire life had been the light he walked in, the shield he hid behind. And now, the same stories, the sacrifices, the truth of what it took to raise him, were inconvenient. "So what exactly are you saying?" I asked, my voice low, calm, though every muscle in my body trembled. "I'm saying," he swallowed hard, his eyes flicking away, "we love you, but maybe it would be best if we saw each other less often. Not every family dinner, not every event. We'll still do lunches, just the two of us, but the bigger things, it might be easier if you weren't there as much." In that moment, I felt my heart break in a way I had never known before. It wasn't the cruelty of strangers, nor the dismissal of in-laws. This was my son, my only son, the boy I had carried through sickness and hunger, asking me to step back, to fade into the background of his life like a ghost. I looked at him carefully, memorizing his face, the strong jaw, the polished suit, the life I had given him. And behind all of that, a distance I could no longer cross. "That's fine," I said finally. My voice was steady, but inside, something crumbled. "I understand perfectly." Relief flooded his face. He leaned forward and hugged me, a quick, practiced hug, as though he believed we had solved something rather than torn it apart. But as his arms wrapped around me, a cold clarity took root in my chest. This was not just a request to step aside at parties. This was a declaration. My son was ashamed of me. The very life I had built for him, the sacrifices that shaped him, had become a stain he wanted hidden. When he left, closing the door behind him, the silence of the apartment was unbearable. I sat in my rocking chair, staring at the faint outline of the embroidery threads I had left on the table, and felt the weight of 32 years collapse onto my shoulders. 4 decades, I had been more than his mother. I had been his anchor, his provider, his compass. And now, with a handful of careful sentences, he had reduced me to a burden, a complication, an embarrassment to be managed. Tears didn't come right away. Instead, there was a stillness, a coldness that settled deep inside me. It wasn't explosive grief, it was quieter, heavier. Like the moment before fabric tears, when you hear the faint stretch of threads about to snap. That night, as I lay awake in the dark, I knew something inside me had changed. I had spent a lifetime living for Ethan, shaping my entire existence around his needs, his future, his happiness. But if my presence was no longer welcome, if my life's sacrifices were something to be hidden rather than honored, then it was time to face a truth I had avoided for too long. Maybe it was time to stop living only as Ethan's mother. Maybe it was time to remember who I was. And in that quiet, painful moment, as the crack inside me widened, the first seeds of transformation began to grow. The days after Ethan's visit stretched on in silence. At first, I waited for a call, a message, some sign that he regretted the words he had spoken. But nothing came. And when nothing comes, silence itself becomes an answer. I moved through my apartment like a ghost. The walls seemed to echo with memories that now hurt more than they comforted. The framed letters from Ethan's college years. "Mom, I'll buy you a big house one day. I'll never forget your sacrifices," stared back at me with cruel irony. He had kept the promise in part. He bought me gifts when he could. He thanked me with words when it suited him. But respect, inclusion, love without condition, that had quietly vanished. For 2 weeks, I tried a quiet experiment. I stopped calling him first. I stopped sending my good morning and sleep well texts. I stopped asking about their plans. And the result was more painful than I dared imagine. It took him 8 days to call me, and when he did, it was only to ask if I could embroider his new shirts for work. No questions about how I was. No mention of my silence. No recognition of my loneliness. Only need. That night, as I stitched his initials into the crisp white cotton, a decision began to form. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind people write about in novels. But a quiet, steady decision. The kind that grows like a seed in soil you didn't know was fertile. I would change. Not for them, not to win back their approval, but for myself. So I started small. The next morning, I left the house without my phone for the first time in years. I walked to the community center where flyers advertised basic computer classes. For decades, I had told myself I was too old to learn, that technology wasn't for me. But I signed my name on the list with a hand that trembled, not from fear, but from excitement. Later, I called my sister Maya in Charleston. "I want to visit you," I told her. "Not for a weekend, longer. Maybe a month." There was a pause, and then her voice, thick with joy. "Grace, I've been waiting 20 years to hear you say that." I opened a new savings account at the bank, one with my name only. For the first time in my adult life, I put money aside not for Ethan, not for emergencies, not for family obligations, but for me. Travel. Hobbies. A future I could shape. Each step was small, almost invisible. But inside, it felt revolutionary. When Ethan called again to ask if I could watch Simone's children one Saturday, I said words I had never said before. "I can't. I already have plans." There was a pause on the line, then his surprised voice. "What kind of plans?" "I'm going to the movies with some friends from class," I replied simply. "And then dinner." The silence that followed was long. For the first time in his life, my son had to process the idea that his mother's world didn't revolve around him. That she had her own life, her own priorities. After I hung up, I sat in my chair, not the rocking chair of sacrifice, but a new one I had bought for comfort, and smiled. Not a smile of revenge, not even defiance. A smile of liberation. Each day after that, I added something new. I joined an embroidery workshop at the art center and met women who, like me, had given their youth to families that now barely noticed them. There was Gloria, who learned to drive at 69. Alicia, who finished her high school diploma at 71. And Otelia, who started painting professionally after her husband passed. "The secret," Otelia told me one afternoon as we stitched side by side, "is to stop asking permission to live." Her words sank deep. I had spent decades waiting for Ethan to call, waiting for family to include me, waiting for approval to simply exist as more than someone's mother. That waiting was over. I began to dress differently, too. Bright colors, bold patterns, clothes that made me feel alive instead of appropriate for my age. The first time I wore a crimson blouse to class, another student told me I looked radiant. And for the first time in years, I believed it. My weekends no longer belonged to family obligations. I filled them with markets, movies, long walks, and dinners where laughter was shared without judgment. And the more I lived for myself, the more I realized my world had not grown smaller without Ethan. It had grown larger. For the first time since Curtis's death, I was not just Ethan's mother. I was Grace, a woman with her own story, her own desires, her own worth. And though Ethan and Tasha noticed the change with confusion, even unease, I no longer bent myself to explain it. For years, my love for them had required silence and sacrifice. Now, my love for myself demanded something different. Boundaries, dignity, freedom. I hadn't stopped loving my son. I never would. But for the first time in 32 years, I was also loving myself. And that, I realized, was the beginning of everything. The first weeks of my new life felt strange, almost unreal. For decades, my days had been shaped by Ethan's orbit. His school runs, his meals, his birthdays, his crises. Now, without that pull, my hours unfolded like blank fabric on a table, waiting for me to decide what pattern to stitch. I began gently, one thread at a time. Mornings became mine. I no longer rushed to tidy the house, just in case Ethan and Tasha visit. Instead, I brewed coffee in the new machine I bought for myself, sat on the porch, and watched the neighborhood awaken. The breeze through the trees, the sound of sparrows quarreling over crumbs, it was music I had never slowed down enough to hear. I reorganized my home, turning it from a museum of motherhood into a sanctuary of self. The guest room, once reserved for visitors who rarely came, became my sewing studio. I painted the walls a warm cream, moved in a large table, and spread my fabrics wide, not caring if they stayed there for days. The living room shelves filled with books I had bought simply because their covers intrigued me, not because I thought someone else would approve. Every corner whispered, "This space belongs to you now." Then came my trip to Charleston. For years, my sister Maya had invited me, and for years I had said no, always afraid Ethan might need me. But now, I boarded the bus with a small suitcase and an open return ticket. When Maya greeted me at the station, her eyes welled up. "Grace, you look lighter," she said. And I realized I was. Those 2 weeks with Maya felt like breathing fresh air after a lifetime of holding it in. We visited sweetgrass basket weavers, colonial churches, art markets. I walked unfamiliar streets with no agenda except wonder. I rediscovered parts of myself I had buried. My love for history, my curiosity about art, my joy in conversation that wasn't shadowed by obligation. It was there, in Charleston, that I made a vow. I would never again reduce myself to just Ethan's mother. I would always love him, but I would not disappear behind his life. When Ethan called to ask when I was coming back, his tone held impatience. "Tasha is planning a dinner. We need to know if you'll be available." I looked out at the harbor, the sunlight dancing on the water, and replied calmly, "Tell her not to count on me. If I'm back, I'll come. But I don't know when that will be." The silence on the other end told me everything. He was facing, for the first time, a mother who would not drop everything to fit his schedule. And though his surprise stung, I felt a quiet triumph. My life, finally, was mine. When I returned to Atlanta, I carried that new strength with me. I joined an advanced embroidery class, and to my shock, the instructor asked me to help teach beginners. For years, my skill had been dismissed as old-fashioned. Now, in a bright room filled with eager hands, I was valued as an expert. Women decades younger than me leaned in as I explained stitches, asking questions, calling me teacher. It wasn't just skill they saw, it was dignity. And their respect gave me back something my son's dismissal had taken. Friendship followed. Gloria, Otelia, and Alicia, my classmates, became companions who reminded me that 67 was not an ending, but a beginning. We went to the movies. We shared meals at restaurants where no one expected us to serve or clear. We laughed like girls, free and unapologetic. The first time I told Ethan I couldn't babysit for Simone because I already had plans with these women, his disbelief was almost comical. "What kind of plans?" he asked. as if the very idea of me having a life was absurd. "My kind of plans," I replied simply. That answer, so small yet so firm, was the line in the sand. From that moment forward, I was no longer the invisible woman waiting for scraps of attention. I was Grace, a sister, a friend, an artist, a student, a woman with a voice and a will. And slowly, something miraculous happened. Ethan and Tasha, confronted with my independence, began to look at me differently. Confusion softened into curiosity, and curiosity, at times, into respect. When they invited me to an art studio because they thought I'd enjoy it, I realized, for the first time in years, they were including me not out of duty, but because they valued who I was. That was the rebirth. Not revenge, not confrontation, but the steady return of dignity, stitched together day by day, choice by choice. I had spent 32 years building a son's life. Now, at last, I was building my own. Months passed, and the woman I had once been, the invisible mother, the tolerated guest, felt like a distant shadow. In her place stood someone new. Not new by birth, but by discovery. Grace. Not just Ethan's mother. Not just the widow who stitched her survival into fabric. But Grace, a woman who had chosen herself after a lifetime of being chosen last. It started with subtle shifts. Ethan and Tasha began to notice my refusals weren't acts of rebellion but simple truths. I can't babysit. I have plans. I won't attend. I've arranged a trip. At first, their voices carried confusion, even irritation. But slowly, confusion turned into curiosity, and curiosity gave way to something deeper, respect. The turning point came one Sunday. Ethan called, not for a favor, not out of obligation, but with genuine excitement. "Mom," he said, "Tasha and I want to take you somewhere. An artist's studio." He specializes in African American textile work. We thought, "You'd appreciate it." For the first time in years, their invitation wasn't about them, it was about me. My passions, my knowledge. When we walked through the studio, I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in decades. The artist spoke about stitches and patterns, and I found myself answering his questions with detail and precision. Ethan and Tasha stood quietly, watching me, listening to me. Not as an inconvenience, not as an elder to be managed, but as someone who knew, someone whose voice carried weight. "I didn't know you knew so much," Tasha admitted on the drive home. Her voice carried awe, not pity. "I never thought to ask," Ethan added, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. There was something in them I hadn't seen since he was a boy, pure admiration. That moment didn't erase the pain of the past, but it rewrote something essential. For the first time in years, my son and his wife looked at me not as an accessory to their lives, but as a whole woman with wisdom, skill, and dignity. And yet, the greater transformation was not theirs, it was mine. Because by then, I no longer lived for their approval. My days were filled with laughter from my embroidery circle, dinners with friends, books I devoured late into the night, and classes that challenged me. When they called, I answered with love, but my voice no longer trembled with desperation. If they invited me, I joined with joy, but only if it fit the life I was building. I had discovered the truth. Respect isn't begged for, nor demanded. It is lived. It is earned not through sacrifice alone, but through the courage to stand tall in your own worth. Months later, as I sat in my garden watering the geraniums I had planted for myself, I reflected on the journey. I had gone from being invisible in a ballroom filled with laughter to being unmissable in my own story. My love for Ethan had not faded. It had matured. No longer clinging, no longer desperate, but steady, strong, free. And for the first time in decades, I understood. True love, whether for family or for self, must begin from fullness, not from emptiness begging to be filled. That is the lesson I carry now. And if anyone were to ask me what the sound of their joy without me did to my heart, I would answer. It broke me, yes, But in that breaking, I was reborn. Respect cannot be demanded, but it should never be denied to those who gave us everything. Parents are not burdens, they are bridges. And if we are wise, we honor the bridges that carried us across. But when respect is withheld, strength comes from remembering. Dignity begins the moment we choose to love ourselves.